All right. Hello, this is Gabriel Roberts here with Professor Todd McGowan, expert on Hegel, psychoanalysis, and film studies, author of several books, the one in question or conversation today being Emancipation after Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution, which for me has been crucial for my own understanding of Hegel, as well as tearing with the negative in general, so to speak. So thank you for your time.
Sure, sure.
So, for my background, my commitment to philosophy follows three events really in my life. One being the experience of being an angsty teenager exposed to Camus, and then the political disenfranchisement following the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, uh, as well as coming into a formal education in philosophy, sort of following a Heraclitus, Zeno, Spinoza, Hegel pipeline is what I've started to call it.
Okay.
All right. So my first question is, what was your call to Hegel?
Call to Hegel. So I read Hegel for the first time in graduate school, and I had a sense that he was important, I guess. I mean, I had read, you said this angsty teen thing. So I read Sartre and Camus when I was in high school, and I knew that for Sartre, Camus, I mean, for Sartre, Hegel was an important thinker. And I also just had the general sense that he was in the background of a lot of people that I was reading and in graduate school. And I thought I needed to read him. So one summer I did a independent study uh, reading Phenomenology of Spirit and Being in Time. That was my summer reading, and that was pretty great. And that was basically the start. And then I wrote things that were Hegelian and Hegel influenced, and then started to accumulate things that were more directly on Hegel. And then I had an idea that I wanted to write a book on Hegel, but I didn't know German, so I had to basically teach. Luckily, I teach at a university where I can take classes in German for free. So I taught myself German and took I think the equivalent of a German major in classes, and then I just kind of gradually accumulated. So that book took a long time to write. The one you mentioned, maybe a 10-year period. I started working on it, and then it actually was two chapters longer, and each chapter was an additional section longer, and the press wanted it cut, and so that was a sad process for me. I had to cut. I think I cut 70,000 words out of it or something like that. So a whole lot. Like one of the things that the one point of contention was they wanted to not have the German. Like in the footnotes, I have all these German translations, and I insisted on that, but that cost me another chapter on the other end. So that that was some of it was fat that could have gone, but a lot I liked both of those chapters, and I was kind of sad that I cut them. But anyway, that yeah. So I started in graduate school, and then I just found myself more and more compelled by him, and this idea of dialectics, and I guess the other thing is I felt like no one had said just basically what I thought was the point of Hegel's thought. That is that and I think I got this probably from psychoanalysis to some extent, that we're drawn to contradiction, not that we're trying to solve it, and that's the movement of his works. And so that's probably the reason why I decided to write it, because I thought, oh, maybe no one said this. I feel like it should be said.
Right. Well, I have found it invaluable for my own understanding of Hegel, as I've said, and I think contradiction as a key concept has been able for me to make sense of um, just the more obscure passages in phenomenology. I've actually found that the science of logic, for whatever reason, for me is much easier to follow work than the phenomenology, and I guess that's just the um, difference in style.
Yeah, I think a couple things on that. So you're in good company, because my friend Slavoj Žižek thinks the same thing. He thinks the logic is by far the better and easier book than the phenomenology. Uh, I think a couple reasons for that. I think that it's the transitions in the logic are much more logical. They,
Yeah.
I think that really helps. Uh, and I think it's more structured, like the overall structure makes more sense. And I think part of it is he didn't Hegel had a hell of a time revising the phenomenology and rethinking it as he was composing it. So I think he didn't have that same idea of like, oh, I'm doing this thing, and like there are two different tables of contents for the phenomenology, and there aren't for the logic, right? It just has its own, and I think neither of those tables of contents are actually correct, right? Like that they correspond to what the main they don't even break it down to the sections that I would break it down into. So I'm not sure if he really knows what he's doing in that book totally. But I think in the logic, he's older, he's interestingly he's in a certain way less established when he wrote the logic, because he's just a he's a rector at a gymnasium. He's a high school teacher, basically, high school principal, basically. And he was at Jena when he wrote the phenomenology, and he basically lost his job because Napoleon destroyed the university in Jena. So he was a little, I mean, it wasn't a great position there, but at least it was a post. um, so yeah, I don't know. I don't think the career explains it, but he was more mature. You know, I think he had more of a sense of what he wanted to do. So I think that's probably right in terms of readability, except for all that stuff on infinitesimal calculus. But I
Oh
just think,
man. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I don't think, I mean, I love Hegel, but I don't think anybody should be writing 50-page footnotes really to a book. Like, that's
Oh
just
yeah. Yeah. I
little.
was just turning pages there.
Yeah, I know,
Math is not
I
my
know.
strong suit at
The
all.
good thing is that I had a student who's a math, like a, I never use this word, but she really is this, like a math genius. And I converted her, people at UVM converted her over from math to Hegel. And she said, the math is unimportant. Like, it's unimportant. So I liked that I got a kind of confirmation.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
you know,
good. That's good news for me too.
yeah, good news. So don't worry about it. That's what she said.
All right. So could you speak on the distinction between speculative and formal propositions, or more broadly, what it means to think speculatively with contradiction?
Yeah, I think that's maybe the key Hegel idea, and why certain people hate him so much, like Karl Popper and Bertrand Russell, because they don't like that idea of a speculative proposition. But I think for Hegel, so an ordinary or formal proposition takes uh, two things and makes them equal, right? And there's an identity in the formal proposition uh, that trumps, ends up, for Hegel, trumps the difference, right? And his idea of a speculative proposition is one in which yeah, there's identity, like the identity of, I could say, like, I am uh, I am Todd, right? And so those two things are in that kind of formal proposition. There's a identity. Um, it, it, for Hegel, a speculative proposition includes difference within it, right? So it is identity, but it also, it's like, this is the way he puts it. It's not very uh, poetic, but the identity of identity and difference, right? Like that. So that I think is um, indicated by the speculative proposition. What's interesting, I think, is that for Hegel, it's not that there are in the world formal propositions and speculative propositions that just exist. Instead, uh, it's two different, for him. There's two different ways of thinking about propositions, right? You can think about them in this, what he calls ordinary way, formal way, or you can think about them in the speculative way. So in any kind of proposition, you can there can be difference, and you can grasp this identity of identity and difference, or you can treat them in this ordinary way, which is just about identity. And that's the so one of the things that I think logicians, this is Bertrand Russell especially, bothers the logicians about Hegel, is that for them he confuses principles of identity, like, I am the person that wrote Emancipation after Hegel. So the two things are just identical. And then predicative propositions, right? Like, I am short or I'm tall, right? So which for Russell, those do include difference, whereas I am the person that wrote the book Emancipation after Hegel. There's no difference in that, right? And Hegel would just say, sorry, there's actually difference in every proposition. So yeah, we can treat a proposition as a formal or an ordinary one, but we could also treat any proposition in this speculative way. So that's what I think for me, that was really important to think about, because I think a lot of readers of Hegel say, well, okay, there are certain propositions that are formal or ordinary, and then there are certain ones that are speculative. And I don't think that's true. Like, I think that you can, it's for Hegel an approach to a proposition that, and what's interesting is, I think for him, first you approach it in an ordinary way, and then that allows you to approach it later speculatively. So I think that's what's kind of interesting. He has this great line I think it's in the Phenomenology, where he says, ordinary logic has its rights, ordinary and I think that's what he means.
So would it be fair to say then that like all speculative propositions are a dialectical result, maybe necessarily starting with some sort of formal proposition and then moving from there, I guess this idea of immanence as opposed to
Yeah,
externality?
yeah, that's perfectly put. Yeah, it's perfectly put. Exactly. Yeah, that there's a dialectical. First, you have the formal proposition, and then if you treat it dialectically, you see how it actually has this speculative dimension to it. And you're right; it's an immanent movement from the one to the other. It's not this external. That's the thing I probably love about Hegel's thought more than anything else. The way it's about immanent critique and not about an external, oh, that position's wrong because it doesn't think about X, Y, or Z, right? It's always about how can we understand it according to its own presuppositions, its own determinations, right? And then that's the nature of his attack, if you would even call it attack. It's more of like a self-undermining of the position, right?
Right. So in your first chapter, you write, if one begins by treating all propositions as speculative, one paradoxically misses contradiction by finding it everywhere. And this is something that I struggled with when first encountering Hegel, because there is that temptation to, if you know, kind of, or have heard or read something out of secondary literature, then you're importing and trying to schematize rather than work through the concept. So, how, in your view, does Hegel resist schematization contrary to the attempted schematization of most of his interpreters?
Yeah, I think that's a really. I fell victim to that when I first. I can remember when I was reading the Logic, and I was just so it's like reading contradiction everywhere, and I think that's basically. And my spouse finally said, "Okay, stop saying that." Like, just she just had it. Um, so I think that it's tied to what we were just saying. The way that the word that you brought up of immanence, right? Like, it's not about seeing. Uh, the contradiction immediately, right? It's instead about tracing through the position on its own terms and then recognizing how the contradiction emerges just imminently out of whatever position it is that you're addressing or dealing with. So it's never about this like, oh, I have a schema of contradiction that I'm imposing on them. I mean, Hegel, I think it could have been maybe he wouldn't have found contradiction, right? Like, I think you have to be open to that if you approach um, philosophies, theories in this way, like maybe they work out. I mean, you have to. I think he 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 thinks that when he approaches any theory, like maybe sense of certainty is going to work out. Maybe it's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Maybe. I mean, he was invested in the French Revolution, so maybe abstract freedom works out, but then it doesn't for him, right? So I think that's the key, is to invest oneself in the position that one's addressing, and rather than take this external, as you called it, like schematic approach to the position.
great, great. So, what is the relationship between formalism and ideology? Because it seems as though the rejection of the speculative is largely based on a presupposed bias that contradiction is the mark of either a linguistic or a logical failure. Not always is that the case, but I think,
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting question, right? Because I think you're correct that often that's how ideology functions, by the denial of contradiction, right? Um, but I was just thinking, it can also function. When you said formal, it made me think like, because sometimes ideology today, at least, is the denial of the importance of form at all, right? Like it's
right,
like ideology overwhelms us with content. I mean, this seems to me like internet is the perfect example of this, right? Like you just are bombarded with way too much content, so you can't even navigate it, right? So how do you even know? And so that's the ideological gesture. And so even the formal mechanism of like sifting stuff out doesn't exist. It's very hard to construct that. It doesn't exist for us. And so I think in that sense, I'm tempted to say that ideology today is often the abandonment of form, right? Like the downplaying of form in service of content. But I think in general, I think your point is right, that's still a way of not seeing contradiction, right? Like if you're overwhelmed by the content, you're just it seems it's what it seems like, and I think this is a key. I mean, I'm tempted. I think I might say this somewhere, maybe in this book. I don't know, maybe somewhere else. But I almost think that I do think that the fundamental gesture of ideology is to turn contradiction into difference, right? And this overwhelming us with content, it's all just difference, right? It never, the things are never in contradiction with each other or with themselves, right? Like that's what we never see, the way in which, okay, this thing is actually self-contradictory, this whatever the position is, and instead we just see a mass of differences. And I think that's uh, it's interesting, because someone like Gilles Deleuze, he would say the exact opposite. He would say ideology is turning difference into contradiction, right? So I think there's a real nice, I like these cutting lines, right, between thinkers and between, and I think that's a real cutting line between how you define ideology is really I think that really tells you something about the theorist or the theory that you're dealing with.
interesting. Okay. So, where fields such as mathematics might necessarily be limited to insights into particularities within quantity and measure, could science arrive at speculative insights? I know we mentioned earlier that there is, you know, or there are just formal insights and formal modes of thinking, but there are, speculative is kind of this turn to maybe thinking things infinitely rather than in the finite. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think that's very good. I think that there is definitely an alignment between infinitude for Hegel and dialectics and speculative thinking, right? Like they're all in the same conceptual constellation, I think. Yeah. Because for him, uh, infinite is, and I think this is really important, right? He distinguishes between what he calls like the the true infinite, right, and the bad infinite. And for him, the bad infinite is how we usually think of the infinite. Like it just goes on and on and on and on. And the good infinite, or the true infinite, is what comes back. It's this circular process to it, and that also is this. It's speculative, right? Because it it comes back to an identity that involves itself with difference. So for him, the true infinite is necessarily speculative as well. So that's definitely, I think you're exactly right about that connection.
Right. So, moving into more of the identity. Um, so, things such as the law of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. And you touched on this earlier. What does it mean when Hegel says identity is the identity of identity and difference? And what does thinking through or realizing this motive being grant for subjectivity?
Yeah, right. So he's trying to so he gets a lot of times be accused as being the philosopher of identity, and I think part of this is because this idea of the absolute brings everything under a single identity. But I think what he's trying to do is explode the notion of identity from within and to say, uh, okay, that when I achieve some kind of identity, it's not what I think it is. It's not a self identity. That everything that seems like a perfect self identity has to involve this otherness that is constantly in it and making it alien to itself. So there's not for Hegel a self identity that overcomes. It's not like you encounter the other, overcome the other, and then you know who you are. Like I think that's how something like fascism works, right? Like you identify, say, the the the, the Nazi identifies the figure of the Jew, right, and says, okay, I'm going to eliminate that figure, and then I know that I'm a Aryan or German or whatever, right? Um, but that's not what it is for Hegel, because for Hegel, that encounter with that difference has to be integrated into that's part of what identity means for him. So yeah, I don't think that it's overcoming of difference. I think it's the recognition about how I'm that thing, whatever is other to me, is actually integral to who I am. I can't separate those things, and so that's why I think Hegel doesn't believe in enemies, right? Like the person that's your adversary is in some way integral to your subjectivity, your identity, and so for him, if you the idea of an enemy is I can just if I can eliminate that figure, then I can be whole. And his point would be, no, you're like that figure is what makes you who you are, right? Like you don't have, and that's why you're too young for this. But in the U.S., there was this incredible crisis in the 1990s because all of a sudden the adversary was gone, right? Like the Soviet Union was the defining. I mean, I remember being even in college, so even in late 80s, it was still like the idea of the US was defined through its relationship to the Soviet Union. Then once that was gone, it was like there was this incredible crisis of identity. And that I think Hegel would really understand that because he'd say, yeah, you're dependent on that otherness to have whatever identity you have.
Which that makes me think of, CNN and Trump. Thank goodness Trump is in the news right now for CNN. So it's kind
Right, exactly. And the funny thing is, he is, of course, like about everything, he lies by saying the truth openly, right? It's a great strategy. Uh, but he's like, you depend on me. Like he says this to CNN, like you want me in power, you need me in power because your ratings when he was out of, I mean, it is amazingly true, right? MSNBC, CNN, during the 4 Trump years, it was manna from the heavens for them, and now it's just catastrophe for the last 4 years. So I think it's clear. You have to sort of look at their strategy, I think, a little bit in terms of that, right? Like, okay, like all of the constant, like Trump, like they count up the number of lies in his speech on CNN. This is one of their little strategies or whatever. Uh, and it's interesting. Like, okay, what are they really trying to do, right? Like, are they really trying to subvert their own source of popularity? Probably not, right? Probably they're actually engaged in a maybe unconsciously, but in a way of like battling him to keep him relevant,
of.
so that they can continue to be themselves relevant, right? Because if they're look, let's face it, if Kamala Harris, like let's assume Biden is elected or Kamala Harris takes over at some point, that's not a winning hand for CNN or for MSNBC. So I think that they know where their bread is buttered, right? Like they know and I think they understand on some level that this is not, that their coverage is not hurting his popular. It helps him, right? It doesn't hurt him. So
Right. So changing gears a little bit, what do you make of the notion that to be is to be free, or that the structure of freedom is a given, and it is our ideal then as subjects to uncover the structure within ourselves and or the world?
did I say that?
You didn't say that. This is
Okay.
something that I've kind of, I don't know if I'm, this is an interpretation, maybe, and
I
maybe a,
know, I love that actually. That's why I was
okay,
wondering if I said it. Yeah, I didn't think I said that, but I really like that. I think it's very good. And I think it's a little variation on Jean-Paul Sartre's "We're Condemned to Freedom," right? But I think it's true. And I think it has its basis. This is what I would argue. I think it has its basis in our, the, 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 the way in which, what can we call it? Like even I'll just put it in Hegelian terms since we're talking about Hegel, right? Like in the fact that there is no substantial other, right? There's no, any force that tries to tell us what to do is itself divided. And I think this is, Hegel repeats in the preface phenomenology, I think 5 times, some version of substance is subject. And I think that's what he's getting at, that we're free because there's no force out there that can that can that is undivided, that can make us do or think even a certain thing, no matter how successful it is at manipulating us, right? And so I like that idea that the task of philosophy or thinking is uncovering that freedom. That's, I think, how you put it. I really think that's true, and like finding out where it is and how to access it, right? Like I think that's because I think a lot of times problem with freedom, as I'm sure you know, is that it's such an open concept, right? Like it can be manipulated by the far right and taken up by the far right, and can be taken up by the far left. I was just doing, I don't know, like 3 weeks ago, a podcast. Some guy accidentally saw my book Capitalism and Desire. He thought it was about capitalism, and so I was on this pro-capitalist uh, podcast. It was fine. He was nice. I mean, we just disagreed about everything, uh, but he for him, he was like, it's all about what capitalism does. It gives us freedom. I'm like, well, no, it does. It's like the last thing it gives us. So that's why it's very. I think it's very important to to struggle over that term, right? Like I think it's a really really important term. I don't think it's one we should abandon. I remember a reader of one book, not this one, but a different one, said to me, just, freedom is like, that's the right wing term. You got to be on the side of equality. Or I said, no, I'm not giving up the term freedom at all. That's they're stealing our term. That's our term. So I don't. Yeah, I absolutely think so. I totally agree with that statement. But I think it's a battle worth fighting for sure.
So subject, or coming back to substances, subject, or logic, this idea of logic as ontology and vice versa might appear to the uninitiated as bizarre or even totalizing in a constrictive sense. So what for you is the key in seeing the openness within totality?
Well, I think it's tied, for me, it's tied to this idea of contradiction, right? Like that it's, and I think that's why it's the opposite of that fear, right? That I think when you don't think or experience the totality or the whole, then there's always this openness where you can say, well, right there's no contradiction, right? Like in that, and I think people do this about the future all the time. They say, oh, there's a future out there. We don't know it yet, but it's going to be they don't say it like this, of course, but it's going to be non-contradictory, right? People are going to get along. It's going to be all like peace on earth. Uh, but I think that but if you think about the totality, then and without this opening to the outside, then you think that allows you to think that, oh, every spot in there is contradictory, and that's the openness, right? Like that's the openness. And I think Hegel's very good on that. I think that's his whole idea of the absolute, is that you think the total, you experience, think the totality, and then that is what makes evident the opening. It doesn't close off the opening. And so that's to me why I think 20th century, late 20th century thought basically really missed the, it's basically an attack on Hegel, most of these important thinkers, and around this idea of totality. And I think it just was a complete misfire, like missed the boat.
So, what do you make of the project of discovering an authentic self, or how does Hegelian identity problematize the project of existentialism? In what ways could we envision the Hegelian existentialism?
Oh, hopefully in my way. I mean, I hope that I'm doing that. I really, as I said, and you said, you brought up Camille, I brought up, sorry. Like from the beginning, that was what I was doing. And I don't think all these other things I've kind of added to that project, but I've never deviated. I don't think I've deviated from it. I mean, I don't know, Jean-Paul Sartre would have thrown me out for my investment in the unconscious, but I think but the answer to your question is, I think that Hegel allows us to see that the authentic has to be grounded first and foremost in the inauthentic. And I think it's tied to that question that we dealt with the formal and the speculative propositions, right? Like you have to go through the formal to get to the speculative. You have to go through the inauthentic to get to the authentic. You have to go through the false to get to the true. That's to me the great Hegelian lesson. And I think that is against, and I think that's what the whole existentialist tradition has failed to think because of its, to my mind, ruinous investment in phenomenology, which thinks first there's truth, then there's fiction. Dialectics thinks, no, first there's fiction, then there's truth. And I think everything depends on that shift. And I think the Hegelian existentialism, which is, phenomenology is a touchy word because, of course, he calls his first book The Phenomenology of Spirit, but that's not phenomenology in the Sartrean, Husserlian, Heideggerian sense. In fact, it's the opposite. And I think that has been the great error of existentialism, is to think first is true, then is false. And Hegel allows us to see first is false, then is true.
Right. Right. That makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to shift to discussing Christian love. In the book, you show how love is the point of departure, where Hegel becomes Hegel. So what does Hegel see as unique and specifically Christian love?
Right. So Christian love is, I think, so important for him because it gets out of the uh, the the framework of the divine framework of every other religion, right? So this idea that God through love comes down, right, and becomes human and dies and gets utterly debased. That I think, so that you can see the speculative identity in that, right? Like the highest is identified with the lowest, and to imagine God as loving, I think, is to imagine also God as divided, right? Like, and I think that's for Hegel what is really at stake in Christian love. That it's how can we envision a loving God? Well, it's a divided, a lacking God, not a substantial God that's beyond and impervious to us. Like God needs us. It's not like we need God for Hegel. It's like God needs us, and I really like that. I think that really captures something really crucial.
Yeah, it was hard for me to reckon with. I went to a Catholic school from kindergarten to eighth grade. So I mean, but on the other hand, like I feel like it was good for me to have this conception of the Trinity, and there are lots of helpful things in Catholicism or Christianity more broadly that can um, help reach the absolute. And I think Hegel sees it the same way. And of course, the parallel between Christianity and love there. Well,
Right. Right. I mean, I just think he would say we've betrayed Christianity in all these terrible ways, right? Which
mhm.
are evident. I mean, I grew up in this fundamentalist disaster, which is the total betrayal, just like your education. But there's certain things I'm appreciative of, just like you said. Like, yeah, it allowed me to understand Hegel in a way that I wouldn't have. It's interesting today because I teach at a it's a relatively liberal school, and none of the kids have had any kind of religious upbringing at all. So I had them read Paul. I was teaching a class on love or something, and I had them read First and Second Corinthians. It was just a dead letter to them. Just said no, this was meaningless to them. So I think I feel kind of sad about that, even though I'm against, in certain ways, against the Christian education that I had, but I do appreciate certain
Yeah,
aspects of it. Yeah,
yeah, for sure.
yeah.
I'm reading Badou's book on St. Paul right now.
It's a great book. It's
Yeah,
his
so
best book,
far.
I think. Yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a great book. Great book.
So, what is Hegel's issue with self-love? Or
Yeah,
the
I don't.
impossibility, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think he thinks that it's possible, right? Because he thinks that love has to involve this other or this radical difference, and so self-love for him doesn't make any sense. So I think that's his issue. I, That is a question, though, right? Because if every subject is divided from itself, why couldn't you have this idea of self-love? So I think it's maybe he misreads himself in this case. I've wondered about that. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think I can see that's what you're thinking, and I think you're probably right about that. I think thinkers misread; they misunderstand themselves. Like that's what it means to be a divided subject, even as
right,
a thinker,
right.
right? You're wrong about your own ideas. Like I have a whole essay on how Hegel's theory of war is just wrong. He just doesn't understand Hegel's thought. Sorry, this is one area. So I think I think that happens all the time.
Yeah, that was going to be my next point because I was thinking about as I was reading this popular idea that you can't love or you can't be in an authentic love relationship without first loving yourself. And I was really thinking about what this could mean, maybe in like a Hegelian way of conceiving it. And I arrived at like the recognition of the self of it as its own other, reconciling the self to the self. And that could look like just maybe the enunciation that one is deserving of love, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So, just as Hegel thinks religion is philosophy for the common man, could we say that love, in a way, is praxis and adopt the politics of love?
Absolutely. I think that's imperative. Yeah. 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 I think when we lose sight of that, it then you get into this kind of what people today call tribalism, where you're just trying to destroy the enemy, right?
Right. So, sublation for Hegel involves, in its three-part meaning, as I understand it, a movement from an impoverished view of a concept to a more enriched concept. Is your problem with the term progress if it is used to describe the deepening of contradiction, that it is too easily misinterpreted?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think that it also suggests that Hegel is um, describing a movement that's historical and that goes historically forward. And I think actually Hegel's great innovation is to tell history backwards, right? Like that he's looking that it's always um, he's like he doesn't. If you think about if you count the philosophy of history as his work at all, which I think is debatable, like it's a collection of student notes to his lectures, and I've seen the student notes to my lectures, and I'm not sure that I would want that to represent my thought, which is odd that that's the thing that people that hate Hegel talk about the most, right? So it's a strange and unfair thing. But I think that the point, if you think about that book, that like, so much of the stuff that he of human history just ignores. He just doesn't care about it. Just like millennia just not even mentioned, right? And why is that? Does he not think it's important? No, he just thinks I'm telling the story of the development of freedom, and then that causes me to pick out certain moments in history that are meaningful, right? So it's from this current concept that I can register the value in the past. So it's not like you see what I'm saying. So it's not like a progress leading forward. It's more like a it's more like looking backwards. So
Right.
that's for me, I guess, why I really have a problem with that idea of progress. Hegel is a progressive thinker. Now, I think Marx is the progressive thinker. Like, I think Marx is clear. I think this is one of the biggest. I don't think, this whole materialist reversal. I don't, whatever. But I think this is the real reversal. Like, Hegel moves from now backwards, and Marx is telling a forward moving story. And I think that's a pretty big difference.
Mhm, for sure. It's retroactivity versus
Exactly. Not Träglichkeit. I think it's the German word. It's really, I think, incredibly important for Hegel's thought. Incredibly.
so how does utopian thinking, speaking of Marx, open up the potential for violence in your mind?
Well, I just think it. I think it. Once you think there's a non-contradictory future out there, then I think all bets are off. Right? Like, then you can do whatever to the opponent, because you think, well, I'm trying to create this kind of world in the future that is worth it. And there's a really good book by Maurice Merleau-Ponty called Humanism and Terror, in which he basically says, yeah, Stalinism was pretty bad, but because they're trying to create the kind of a world of freedom, it's worth it, right? And if you, I think that's only from a utopian perspective that you can say something like that. But if you don't think that, if you think, no, whatever we come, obviously there can be better situations. I mean, there've been better situations in the past, but but that doesn't mean you have a license to. They're still not going to be non-contradictory. They're still going to be beset by antagonism. So I think that as long as you think that, I think functions as a brake on what you can do.
Right. And I think maybe I would classify it, maybe I'm wrong here, but as the difference between like an absolute ideal versus a utopia,
Yeah,
where
very good, very good. Yeah. I mean, I think right. And isn't it terms like freedom, equality, like those are ideals that are
Mhm.
driving us, that are absolute, but they're not utopian, right?
Right.
In fact, they're explicitly not utopian, I
Yeah.
would say. Yeah.
So you clarified that Hegel sees it subjects are impressed by substances, by beings that appear beyond any contradiction. But could this being impressed be in some ways necessary before subjectivity realizes freedom in the same way that one misses contradiction by finding it everywhere?
Yeah, interesting. So you're coming with the subject supposed to know, right? Like
Right.
that's what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. Right. If you don't, like, you can never go into analysis if you don't initially suppose the subject to know. Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think that's right. That there is this like initial, and I think he would even say it's like the child to its parents, right? The child to its guardians, whoever's right. Like, there has to be this kind of initial being impressed, the child to the teacher, right? And I think there is something to that. Um, the question is then, when does it turn, right? Like,
Yeah.
when do you know that you have to? I mean, in psychoanalysis, there's a whole lot. I don't know if there's even a great theory about when it turns and how you know. It's just analysand kind of knows. Like,
Mhm.
they come to this recognition, and the analysts can't do anything to necessarily push it forward. Like, they can't expose their castration or something, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think that is a huge question, but I don't know if there's a good Hegelian answer to that. Maybe someone else has it. I don't think I have it.
Yeah. And on the
But yeah, I
flip side
think you're
of that is just cynicism, this
right. I think cynicism is the danger, right?
Mhm.
And which is far worse than being impressed by
Yeah.
somebody, I think. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we see that today, right? That there's it's a fascinating way that uh, the divide between, say, mainstream liberal uh, culture and then the fundamentalist alternative is, the one is cynical and the other is like rabid belief, but it's like it's definitely impressed by the other. right? Like
Mhm.
there is a figure of the other that is impressed. Like all of these populist movements have a figure at the head of them that impresses the people, right? So I think that's, but then the problem is the alternative is today, at least, is you're exactly right. It's the cynical. There is no, I can't be impressed by anyone, right? Like that's, I'm just going to view everyone with suspicion. Like
Right.
no one really acts according to a certain, like you just said, absolute ideals, right? No one does that. Everyone just is out for them. So everyone's like self-interested actors, right? Which is, to my mind, nonsensical. But I think that is necessary for that cynical position.
Right. And I think the link to capital there is just
It's
super.
evident, yeah, evident, right? Like I think cynicism is the best, the best psychic structure for capitalists, uh,
Mm.
the capitalist society to keep going, right? Like that's the best one. If you want to be a good capitalist subject, be a cynic, right? Like
Mm.
that's the lesson, I think.
All right. Well, I have a couple more questions.
Sure.
So, in the closing chapter, you write reconciliation is the fundamental Hegelian gesture. Emancipatory politics envisions an entirely new form, not simply as a negation of the unfreedom of the market, nor of a flat universality that opens the door to utopian violence. In some ways, I am left thinking about a sort of structure of perpetual revolution in the sense that subjectivity will always be in this, condemned to freedom, as it were, self-determining and reconciling oneself to the intractability of contradiction. So my question is, what does this reconciliation look like, or could look like, as a political practice?
Uh, yeah. I mean, I think if I
The
would have
million
known to
dollar
do that,
question. Yeah.
I would have written it. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Like, I think that's, I think there's a real difference. I think this is a Hegelian point, actually. I think there's a real difference between people that theorize and people that actually are engaged in practical political action, even if sometimes people that are theorizing are engaged themselves, but they're separate when they're doing it, right? And I think that those kind of things, I think that basically all that a theoretical approach can do is say, yeah, this should be like in the background of your practical political activity, but I don't think you can map out what it's gonna look like, really. Like I think, to me, one of the great lessons of the French Revolution is that they didn't really, they had these figures in the background like Rousseau and Montesquieu, but they were basically kind of making it up, like trying to come up with it on their own. And I'm really, I think that there's something really true about that. That you like the theory can be in the background, but it can't give you a roadmap to what it actually looks like. And I mean, it can say like, okay, don't don't be utopian, right? Like those kind of things. Don't require an enemy. Don't there can be these negatives, but I don't think there can be like, okay, set up a society where there's a bicameral legislature and I just don't think it
Yeah.
works that way. And
Yeah.
I don't think, yeah, I don't think
That
that
that yeah, that distinction between negative and positive as a prescriptive thing, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Um, so final question, the largest question.
okay.
Do you have any new theory jokes that you want
Oh, do I have any new
to
theory jokes? Okay. This is coming in a little video I just made, but it's not I don't know. You'll tell me if I should cut it from this video. I don't, it would take too much time to cut it. So it's a Hegel joke, actually. And this is the first time I'm going to put it and release this video sometime soon, but this is the first time I've ever told it to someone else. Uh, all right. So Hegel's, in bed late at night and lights are out and he looks up and sees this terrible image. It's Christ on the cross. The wounds are blood is dripping. He's just horrified and he's like, he's terrified. He flips on the light and he goes, "Oh, thank goodness, it's just a Geist." Okay, you don't think it's very funny? Like
I
ghost
like it. I
guys.
like it. I
Yeah,
like it.
yeah.
I think,
Okay,
you know,
okay,
it's a, yeah, I
okay. No, it's
like
okay.
it. I do
It
like
didn't
it.
work. It didn't work that well, but yeah, that's my new favorite joke. The one I have, the one my one of my favorite jokes is my favorite joke is that one about the monastery. I'm going to tell him that again, but I have a new book on capitalism coming out, and this I told on this capitalist guy's podcast, and he was nice enough to laugh. So there's this Wall Street investment banker. He has a brand new Lamborghini, and he pulls up to his outside his investment bank and opens the door up, and all of a sudden a taxi cab comes screaming by and takes the door off, and he's horrified because it's a brand new car, and he calls the police. Police come, and he's like giving them a description of the guy of the car, the cab, and what the driver looked like, and they're not writing anything down. He's like, "What the hell?" He goes, "Aren't you concerned with like getting the person that did this to my car?" And the officer looks down. And he's like, "Look, you got a lot bigger problems than just losing the door of your car. That guy took your entire left arm off." And the guy looks down. He goes, "Oh my God, I lost my Rolex." So it's a great, to me, the perfect anti-capitalist joke, because I think it's true. Like they're more invested in the commodity than in the logic of the commodity than in their own well-being. So anyway, uh,
Well, thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to delving into the rest of your works. I know I'm gonna start with the universality and identity politics next, I think, and then you mentioned you have a new project
yeah,
here.
I have a book called Pure Excess. It's coming out. It's called Pure Excess: Capitalism and the Commodity. So
Right.
that's
All right.
that's the one. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your
Yeah,
time.
it's great talking to you, Gabriel. Yeah. Good luck with your project.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Stay in touch.
Will do.